70, 75 people logged in so far, expecting over 200. We can hear the echoes coming in with your lines unmuted. So if you would, make sure your lines are muted when you log in. Today's presentation will be recorded, and we will start that recording shortly.
Hey, would you put back this recording on the web so people can listen to it if they couldn't continue all the way?
Yes, that's the plan, to record the entirety of the presentation, and we will have it posted. We'll send out a notification where it gets posted after the meeting.
Thank you.
Sure.
Jay, I went ahead and started the recording. We're just going to give it a few more minutes for some more people to pop on because it looks like we only have about 89 and we had over 200 registered. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I know we have some more people that'll be joining us, but we don't want to lose any time. So good morning, everyone. My name is Michaela McCain. I am the Outreach Manager in the Local Assistance Division. I just wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping items and then introduce you to our speakers this morning. Jay, if you could go to the next slide, please. So on this first slide here, down at the bottom, you will see, and there's two boxes that I have circled in red. The first item I want to address this morning is the mute unmute function. Please make sure that your mics are muted. We have about over 200 people that are registered for this morning's webinar. So we don't want to have too much feedback coming through. If your mic is unmuted, we'll get this really bad echo and you won't be able to hear what the presenters are saying. There is a chat box feature, which if you look over towards the bottom right of my screen, the red box, if you click the chat, that should pull up the chat box. You're also able to see the participants there. And then if you click those three buttons, you'll see the option for polling. We are going to do some live polling this morning. on our webinar. So if you pull that feature up with your chat box open, it'll show how my chat box is over here, where it has the chat feature at the top and then the polling down below. We are already recording the webinar. So we'll be posting this on our website probably by the end of next week. We'll have to wait to get it downloaded and make sure that everything is good. And we'll have it posted, and we'll be sending out an email to everyone who is registered for today's webinar where you can find it. Jay, can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, this last slide, I just want to point out, there is different views that you can do on your screen. The current view that you would be seeing here is if it's the video strip mode, but you can also do different floating panels as well for different views, or you can do a side-by-side view. The floating panels is going to put everything in a separate box though. So you might lose your chat box, or you might not be able to find your polling or something like that. So we recommend having the video strip mode as well. That is all that I have. Housekeeping slides this morning. We will go on. I'm going to introduce the speakers. So this morning we're going to have Anthony Ford. He is the Planning, Programming, and Investment Manager for the VDOT Salem District. We also have Michael Fulcher. He's a Senior Programming Specialist in the VDOT Stanton District. We have Megan Cronice, Transportation Administrator for Roanoke County, and then Jay Guy, he's a Program Manager in the VDOT Salem District as well. Again, I just want to welcome everyone. If you have any questions, you can send them directly to me in the chat box, or you can send me an email, but we will be monitoring the chat box, so please be sure to utilize that. And with that, Jay, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you.
Thanks, Michaela. Good morning, everyone. We're going to run through a couple of intro slides, and then we'll really get into the meat of the funding presentation. We hope throughout the course of the day that you guys think of us as the, I know, bad pun, dad jokes, Fundus League. As we introduced, we got Megan and Fulcher and myself, Anthony, will be kicking us off here in a second. By the end of the day, we hope you guys think of us like this for your funding questions, and hopefully not a couple of these guys at the end. So we're going to test out the polling feature first. First poll: if a dog wore pants, would he wear them like this or like this? So A or B, just testing out the poll, make sure it works. The poll's now open. We're going to leave the polls open throughout the day, about 30 seconds to a minute. If we see all the answers are in, obviously we won't waste everyone's time with leaving it open the whole time, but want to make sure everyone's got time to answer. Looks like most of you guys are coming in, and wow, this will be an interesting results. And I have to say, I agree with you guys on this one. All right, so you guys should be able to see the poll results now. It looks like overwhelmingly the dog would wear his pants on 2 legs. So, all right, thank you guys for helping us test out the polling feature. So we'll jump into the funding puzzle, finding the right pieces and putting it all together. As we move through the day, when you have a project that you want to try to fund, or multiple projects, and you're trying to consider how to do that, there's some key questions you need to ask yourself. What funding is out there? Is there federal money, state money? Is there any match requirements? What do you need to budget at the locality for those things? What rules and requirements are there for those funds? Can you even apply for it? Are your eligible locality to apply for it? And is your project eligible? When will it be available? We'll talk about the scheduling of our different programs. And what do you need to submit that application? What all might you have to even be able to do that? With that, I'm going to turn it over to Anthony. He's going to jump in and talk about our funding sources.
All right, thanks. Appreciate you guys letting me join you today to walk through some of the different funding opportunities that some of you guys might be familiar with. A lot of these. Some of these you might be saying, "Hey, this is the first time I've heard of it," and that's kind of the intent of this, is to introduce you to what we affectionately call the funding menu, all the various options that might be available to you. The document you see on your screen now, and I realize it might be hard to read. We just something we put together in our district a couple years ago. Is just a quick reference tool that we could hand out or send out as an attachment to folks just to kind of keep as a handy tool to pull out. And, as they're thinking about what projects to deliver, which ones they might want to get some more information on. Again, this is not meant to be exhaustive. It's really just meant to introduce you to some of the funding opportunities. And I do want to be clear that even the funding menu that we have there is not comprehensive. For example, we don't include CMAQ funds on our funding menu because that's not an option that we have in our district. So I want to be clear. I don't want anybody to look at this and say, well, hey, this doesn't include all the funding options. You're correct. It does not. And I do want to say that we're happy to share this with folks as desired. If you want to contact me after the fact, I'd be glad to send you a link to it. This will come back to play later in today's exercise as we consider what funding options might be available for the exercise we're going to do later, and also again for you guys to use in the future. And so, do want to point out before we leave this slide that while Jerry and the gang are not socially distanced in the diner there, we have provided them with the appropriate personal protective equipment. So, just want everybody to feel comfortable about that. So, Jay, if you want to go into the next slide. So smart scale is always kind of the usual suspect. That's the one that everybody kind of goes to first as their potential funding opportunity. And I don't want to say that it's not a good funding opportunity. It can very well be. And our agency has shifted a lot of resources behind smart scale project funding those over the last few years. As many of you are familiar with this program, it is a application-based program in which the projects are scored and then prioritized based on various objective processes. We've already now undertaken 4 rounds of the Smart Scale applications. So many of you are already familiar with Smart Scale, so I won't go into too great of a detail. I do want to point out that many of my slides on these funding options available to you are very text heavy, and that's the intent. That's not an accident. I'm not usually a big fan of text heavy slides, but it's there for your future use. As you guys can go back and watch this video later. The PowerPoint presentations are made available to you as a PDF later. You'll be able to go back and use those as a resource. So just want to let you know that I'm not going to hit all the stuff on all these slides, but it will be there available for you in the future. I guess a key takeaway for today's discussion and our exercise we're going to do later on in this morning is that bottom is that for smart scale, you can leverage local money or other non-smart scale money to improve your score. I always use the phrase to buy down your score, whether that's right or not. You have your project scores a certain amount based on need and the characteristics of the project, and then you have a request of smart scale funds. And obviously, the lower that request, the better your overall score will be. And so I just want to point out that a lot of folks have taken advantage of that over the years of applying either local money to leverage against the smart scale request. And that might be an option you guys might want to consider later on this morning as we do our exercise. So, Jay, you want to go to the next slide? So we'll have yet another poll here. If anyone's coffee is yet to kick in, we'll use this as an opportunity to get folks back rallied around their screen here. So the question posed to you guys right now is in round 3 of Smart Scale, and I realize that you're sitting there thinking, well, hey, we're in round 4. Well, the round 4 projects are still being validated and reviewed, and obviously those have not been funded yet. That funding will not come until next calendar year. So round 3 is the latest round that we have of funded projects. So in round 3 of Smart Scale, the highest percentage of projects that were funded fell into what cost range? Is it A, less than $5 million? Again, that's the total project cost. Was it B, $5 million to $20 million? Or was it C, greater than? Yeah, I want to respond to that poll question. And Jay, once you've seen that a good number of responses have come in, you can close that poll. Let's see what you guys responded there. Looks like most of you folks picked either the 5 to 20 million range or the less than 5 million range. So Jay, if you want to go to the next slide, we'll reveal the answer to everyone. So the next slide there, you see the top image for you folks that chose A, the less than 5 million. That's the correct answer. I think that was kind of surprising to a lot of folks. A lot of folks think of Smart Scale as and there are some big ticket projects funded through Smart Scale. I don't want to say there's not, but as you can see that based on the number of projects funded, there is a high percentage of those that fell in the under $5 million category. And so I think that was surprising to some folks. I do want to point out, though, that, again, that was round 3 data. and that every round, can and has been different. And so I guess what they say in the stock market that past performance is not indicative of future indicators and things like that. We can't say that every round is going to look the same and have the same percentages, but I think a lot of folks were surprised and by that top pie chart. Similarly, I'll point out the bottom image shows that, again, in round 3 of the projects funded, 64% of those were highway related type projects. And I don't think anyone was surprised by that, but you see the blue there, 27% were for bike ped facilities. And so again, I think that kind of peels back the curtain a little bit to show that Smart Scale, while it does fund some large highway type projects, there are lower priced projects and more alternative transportation ones that can also be funded through Smart Scale. So just some interesting statistics that came out of round 3 that I thought you guys might want to see. So Jay, if you want to go to the next slide. So again, scale is not new to folks. Again, we've already gone through 4 rounds of this, and so you guys already know a lot of this stuff. Who can apply: cities, towns, counties, regional entities, public transit agencies. A lot of folks can come to the table seeking those funds. That second bullet point is very important, that the project must meet a need identified in VTrans. And if you're wondering, well, what is VTrans, then we definitely need to have further offline about how to identify those needs. You'll see down at the bottom, the very last bullet, projects that did not meet the screening criteria will not be scored. And so obviously if your potential project doesn't fall into the categories or check all the boxes for potential applications, then it will never be considered for Smart Scale funding. So I would just strongly encourage you guys, if you have potential projects that you're thinking of for future rounds of Smart Scale, to definitely work with your district staff to determine its eligibility, to start. You'll see there on the far right, we say round 5 efforts are already underway. And that's not intended to be a joke. Round 4, we know, just wrapped up as far as the locality's submittal of applications back in August. But round 5 will be here before you know it. The calendar's clicking off quicker than ever, it seems. And so I know in our district, we are starting efforts already to try to start working with folks to identify potential projects for round 5. And so we'll have a slide here in a minute and talk about kind of the unending cycle of project funding and identification of good projects. And we'll get to that here later. But again, just want to point out that yes, round 4 did just wrap up, but round 5 will be here before you know it. So again, Smart Scale is a good candidate, a good for funding your project. But some of these other ones that we're going to walk through today are as well, depending on what type of project you have. And so this next slide is talking about. Oh, I'm sorry. Someone said I'm cutting out a little bit. I apologize for that. The next slide is on the TA program. Some folks are familiar with this as the enhancement program. I guess the more correct name in 2020 would be Surface Transportation Block Grant Set Aside, but that's not nearly as fun to say as the TA program. And it'll probably have a new name whenever the new federal transportation bill is reauthorized and we get a new transportation bill. It may have another name, but ultimately, at the end of the day, you guys, again, know it probably as the enhancement program or the transportation alternatives program. And in it, there's a lot of, it's not your typical highway. All right, I've seen another message that folks cannot hear me. Jay, can you hear me?
Hey, Anthony, it's Jay. We can hear you.
Okay.
That may be on the other end.
Okay. All right. Well, all right. Well, you guys let me know if Jay, one of you guys can let me know if you can. I hope the folks can get that worked out on their end. So again, under the TA program, it's not your typical highway construction programs or projects rather. You'll see there on the slide, it's a lot of times non-motorized transportation, enhancing the public's travel experience, revitalizing communities. There are a number of eligible categories that fall under the TA program, and I would encourage you guys to reach out to again, your district staff to see if your potential project falls into one of those. One key takeaway from this slide is that this program does require a 20% local match. That for now, that match can be made up of in-kind contributions, which can be professional services, land value, right-of-way, or donated materials. But do want to be clear that these federal funds do require a 20% local match. So Jay, if you want to go to the next slide. All right, so what type of money are we talking about is available in the TA program? In fiscal year 21 and 22, the one that we just took applications for recently, you'll see there's a total of $40.6 million available. And again, that's a 2-year cycle now. We went to the 2-year cycle, I guess, a couple years ago. And so you'll see the breakdown of what's available to the various parties. You see our district CTB, or Commonwealth Transportation Board members, get $2 million for the 2-year cycle. So again, $1 million per fiscal year. The at-large members and Secretary of Transportation gets a little over 10. And then you see our TPO, or transportation management areas, get a little over $12 million. So collectively, it's over $40 million. And again, I'm not pretending that that it's similar to the amount of funds available through Smart Scale, but it is still a considerable investment by the Federal Highway Administration and by VDOT. And so some of this money very well may fit your desired project perfectly. And again, we encourage you guys to reach out to your district staff to determine whether or not it would make sense to pursue it. Jay, if you want to go to the next slide, it's got a little bit more information on the TA program, which has been very popular for us for all the years that I've been with the agency. One change that happened a couple years ago that I think still might confuse some folks is the Safe Routes to School projects. They are still eligible, but they've now been put up under the umbrella of the TA program. So I know in the application there's a place for you to identify whether or not your potential project is considered a Safe Routes to School project. And so if you guys have one that falls under that, still encourage you guys to pursue. But again, it's not a separate kind of set aside program now. It does fall under the TA program. A couple more takeaways from these slides is the CTB policy is that these projects should go to construction within 4 years of allocation. I know sometimes that there's some difficulties behind that, but you know, the enforcement of that rule really allows us to keep the funds moving on projects that are moving forward. And so if you have a project that, you know, is not quite ready for construction within that period, it's probably not time to pursue TA funding. But again, your district staff can help you with those details. One last takeaway on this slide before we move on is the TA program for the last couple of years has been under a biennial application cycle, with the final applications being due in October. I've put what I have. That's my version of the asterisk now. That little COVID symbol, because who knows with COVID and all the changes. I mean, truth be told, we are still operating under last year's adopted 6-year improvement program because that has not been adopted for this year because of all the implications of funding and all the implications of public meetings and things like that. And so I just wanted to put a quasi asterisk on this slide to say, go ahead and plan for the July pre-application deadline and then the October final application deadline. But I'm sure more information will be coming on that as it becomes available. So Dave, you want to go to the next slide? So the HSIP program, or Highway Safety Improvement Program, is one that I know a lot of you folks have been involved with. I know in our district we've had a lot of great success. We formally allowed localities to apply for those HSIP funds. For the last couple of years, we have not. We've gone to a more systemic program with the agency. And what I mean by that is that they've really taken a look at corridors and done things like flashing yellow arrow projects, installing rumble strips, whether it's edge line or center line, curb delineation, ped crossings, things like that, on more of a corridor level approach as opposed to spot improvements. The reason I put this in here and want to keep this on our funding menu to our district is if and when that comes back available to the localities to apply for, I want folks to keep those potential projects and that potential funding on the radar screen, because I thought it was a really good program that was made available to the localities. I will say that if you folks have areas of high safety concern, high accident, you've had some deaths or injuries at a particular intersection or things like that, to definitely work with your residency and district staff to bring that to their attention and keep and have them see if they can't obtain some HSIP funding. Again, it's not the way it used to be as far as the localities directly apply through the portal, but there still might be some opportunities to find some funding for that, especially if it falls under the systemic approach that we've taken with the program. So Jay, next slide. All right, these two programs are not available in every district, so I don't want to camp out on these and spend too much time. But the RSTP, or Regional Surface Transportation Program, is available to urbanized areas over 200,000. Roanoke TPO became eligible for those. I want to say it's 4 or 5 years ago now. So our district has has gotten familiar with the RSTP funds. We do not have CMAQ or Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Program funds. So I don't have a lot of information on that, but I know that is available to some districts and some localities within those districts. You see the CMAQ funds are for areas designated non-attainment for air quality standards. So again, those two programs are both federal. And you see there at the bottom that the agencies that are involved do receive applications, typically in late fall or early winter, and then they make the programming recommendations to the Commonwealth Transportation Board. One more takeaway on this slide before we move on is that these funds can be commingled with other fund types. Again, going back, I made the point earlier about how you might be able to find other funding to quote unquote buy down your smart scale requests. I know in our district, our folks have been looking at programming some RSTP funds to some potential smart scale projects to, again, for lack of a better term, to buy down that smart scale request so that it would improve the score there. So that is an option for folks. I want to make sure that folks were aware of that. So Jay, if you want to go on to the next slide, we've got one more poll for the folks in case I have lulled the people to sleep with my voice here. We'll have another poll to ask you guys. So which one of these is an actual acronym that VDOT uses? FLIP, FLAP, FLOP, or SHIELD? Which one of these is an actual acronym that VDOT uses? So we'll take a moment for you guys to respond to that. All right, Jay, you ended the poll and we have the results yet.
Still have a couple of people answering, but I'll close in just a second.
Okay. All righty. Well, it looks like a lot of you folks are dialed in, finger on the pulse of the funding opportunities you have, and FLAP was the correct answer. We probably ought to find other ways to come up with some other funding opportunities to call them FLIP and FLOP just for the heck of it, but FLAP was the correct answer. So Jay, if you go to the next slide, we'll talk about the FLAP program a little bit for a moment here. FLAP stands for Federal Land Access Program. Again, this is to improve access to federal lands. I know in our district, I've been here, I guess now about 12 years. We have had a few of these FLAP projects, probably more so recently than we did initially. And again, this program does require 20% match, and it is administered in coordination with the FHWA Eastern Federal Lands. Their application periods vary. So again, encourage your communication with your district staff so that they can keep you abreast of when those application periods are. There's not, to my knowledge, there's not a defined period or like an exact date every year. It does vary. And I've got some examples on the next slide that we'll get to here in a minute of the FLAP program. But under the ARC program, or Appalachian Regional Commission program, again, I would argue that's kind of like FLAP. We haven't had a ton, although we have had a few in our district. I know some other districts have had some success with that. There are 24 counties and 8 cities eligible. Not every locality is eligible for ARC funds. Again, these are federal, and there is no local match on these. You see under FLAP, there was a 20% local match, and under ARC, there is none. So obviously that raises antennas. Folks love to see 0% local match. And so again, encourage you guys to reach out to your district staff to see, about your project's eligibility. There is some different information on the external VDOT website about this program. So I encourage you guys to go look at that. So again, just wanted to introduce these to you. And Jay, if you'll go to the next slide, I have some examples of some typical FLAP and ARC projects. Under FLAP, you see a list there of ones. Some of these are in our district. You see a lot of bike ped facilities that were funded through the FLAP program. But I want to be clear that this program is not just for bike ped facilities. For example, that bottom one, the city of Norton, that included everything from master plan to trails, roadway improvements, and wayfinding signage. There's a lot of components of that project that were funded under FLAP. And Jay, if you go to one more click there, some examples of the ARC program, you see primarily, at least for the examples I provided, those are roadway construction type projects. Jay, if you want to click again, come back. There you go. We see, at least in our district, they were to like commerce parks or business parks. those type of projects. But some of you folks may already be familiar with the ARC program. If not, and this is the first time you're hearing about, that's great. We love introducing you guys to new funding opportunities. So again, do a little bit more information on digging on that, and then again, reach out to your district staff to find out if your potential project is eligible. JV, you want to go to the next slide? So if you guys are thinking about the funding menu, we're still on the federal side of that menu for right now. JV, you want to go ahead? All right, so the state of good repair, for the first couple of years that we offered that, it was considered state funds, but in beginning, I believe in fiscal year 21, it transitioned to a federal eligible program, and so we are now following the federal processes for primary extension, state of good repair paving, and you'll see that this is kind of self-explanatory. It is for pavement overlay, rehabilitation, or reconstruction projects on primary routes maintained by locality. So if you guys at the local level on the urban side are maintaining a route that is Route 600 or below, and you're thinking, man, my road's getting in pretty cruddy condition, well, you might be eligible for some primary extension SGR paving. Again, it's got to meet a couple criteria there. It's obviously got to have a combined condition index rating of less than 60, and there's some other parameters to go with it. The agency has increased the amount of funding available through this program and the amount of time that we allow you to advertise and construct the project because of the introduction of the federal processes. You see that now it's up to $1.5 million per locality per year, and the project must be advertised within 12 months of allocation. The new thing before we leave this slide, and Jay, if you can go ahead and click, I think there's another image I have of another road section that we've done in our district, is localities can now request VDOT to administer. That happened over the last calendar year where, and you know, I think it was in response to the fact that this program now follows the federal process. We have kind of opened the door to say if localities desire VDOT to administer the SGR primary extension paving project on their behalf, we will. And obviously that's going to require some coordination between the locality and your VDOT district staff. So encourage that communication. All right, Jay, if you want to go to the next slide. So still under the umbrella of good repair and still also on the federal side of the menu, we have the locally owned bridges portion of the SGR. And again, this is for bridge rehab or reconstruction for structures that are owned and maintained by the localities, the local public agency. The big takeaway from this is the structure must be structurally deficient to be eligible for these funds, and the work that's funded through this must take the bridge out of structurally deficient status. That's very important consideration for this funding. Another important takeaway from this is that you must initiate the PE or construction phase within 24 months of award of funding or become subject to deallocation. Again, that's a desire for funds management to keep funds moving on the right projects. And so just be aware of that particular caveat. All right, so under the revenue sharing program, so Jay, if you want to go on to the next slide. We've now flipped the menu, so to speak, over from the federal fund side over to the state fund side. And so on the menu that you guys either already have or will obtain in the near future, we're now on the state fund side. And so it's always attractive. The state funds are always attractive because it obviously doesn't bring with it all the federal processes. You know, you don't have the NEPA requirements or civil rights, DBE goals and things like that. So a lot of folks are interested in the revenue sharing program. Now, I do want to be clear that the first bullet point there says it is a 50-50 matching program. So the locality has to bring 50% of the funds to the table. And when I say to the table, if it's going to be a locally administered project, you don't actually send us the money. You actually just incur the cost, and then we reimburse you for 50% of your costs. And I will pause to say that Jay begged me to say the Jerry Maguire line in the Tom Cruise voice, and I'll spare you guys that pleasure. If you close your eyes and think about it, you all can hear that as you as you look at that image. But so again, the revenue sharing program is open to counties, cities, and towns that are in the urban system. The program allocation has been up to $100 million annually. I foresee that staying at that level. I know there's been tons of questions, at least in our district, about what are the impacts to revenue sharing. Obviously, if you folks applied last year for revenue sharing projects, you know that they were not adopted as part of this year's 6-year improvement program in June as expected. So there's a lot of questions about the revenue sharing program. Possibly at the end of this, maybe during a Q&A session, maybe someone from central office can give some updated information on that. But the revenue sharing program is still a strong one and one that we will continue to participate in. And so I know a lot of you guys have taken advantage of that in the past to continue to keep that on your funding menu for potential funding. I will say real quick before we leave this slide that you'll note at the bottom, we do prioritize applications and into different categories. And that will probably become more important as it has been in previous years, but even more important in coming years as you know, potential fund availability comes to light. You know, the priorities will play even more important role probably. So Jay, if you want to go to the next slide, this is the last. I'm sorry. Yep, that's right. So under revenue sharing, again, I know a lot of you folks have experience with this. We have a high number of projects every year in our district, as I'm sure others do as well. And you see that, you know, it can be anything from construction to reconstruction to improvements to things like intersection, signalization, maintenance. I put on there because it is a eligible category. But if you recall back on the last slide, I noted that the maintenance projects were a priority tier 3. And so often priority tier 3 projects don't get funded. And so typically, I'm just saying I wouldn't want you guys to bank on your maintenance projects being funded through this program, although it is an eligible category. Well, one before we leave this slide, one thing I think that has surprised some people over the last couple of years, you see under construction, the bike ped facility. I know in our district we have some localities that weren't aware that they could pursue funding through revenue sharing for that. And we encourage you guys, once again, I'm kind of sounding like a broken record, but just to reach out to your district folks to talk about eligibility and whether or not it would be. So again, there's a lot of opportunities through the revenue sharing program. I will say before we leave this slide, the bottom image is a major bridge project done in the city of Roanoke. The reason I highlight that is that to date has been our most expensive revenue sharing project that we've done in our district, at least in my time here. That's a really neat bridge project that, if you can tell by the image, goes up over multiple lines of railroad and then dips back down under Route 220. It was a really neat project, and like I said, probably our most expensive revenue sharing project to date. And so just wanted to highlight that one real quick before we move on. So Jay, if you go and go to the next slide. A little bit more on revenue sharing, and then we'll move off of this topic. But again, it's one that a program that really facilitates the delivery of projects that are of local importance. You know, you guys may have projects that are really important to you that are still really good projects, but may not fit into the other funding categories for a number of reasons. And so this is one that I wanted to highlight, definitely spend a little bit more time on. Typically, it's for projects that can be delivered relatively quickly. In the past, we have programmed money in year 1 and year 2 of our 6-year improvement program. Some of that may be up in the air as far as what fiscal years we'll be funding based on you know, the impacts to revenue and the impacts of the 6-year improvement program. But more to come on that. But again, typically in the past has been for projects of local importance and ones that can be delivered relatively quickly. I do note that these funds can be leveraged against other federal funds. And when they do, obviously, those projects would need to follow the federal processes. But when used independently on a just revenue sharing, you know, state funded project, the federal regulations are not applicable, just like I mentioned earlier. And there's probably going to be some opportunities to streamline your project delivery. Also want to point out on this that, you know, the CTB has really strengthened the deallocation and transfer rules over the last few years. And maybe you guys have felt that. And that has been a good thing from a statewide perspective. We've been able to identify a lot of funding that we could put back into the pot and put back into the hopper for funding additional. I think you'll continue to see enforcement of the deallocation and transfer rules. Again, just like under the TA program, I've got my little quasi asterisk there to delineate that in the past, the biennial application cycle has been pre-apps in July with final applications in October. Now, again, not certain if that'll be the case in 2021 or not, but for your planning purposes, I would plan on that. And then obviously more information will come out as it becomes available. And then the last funding program that we'll talk about, or funding programs, I guess plural, would be under the access road programs. And again, this is on the state funded side of your funding menu. This can be economic development access, recreational access, or airport access. Again, this is for upgrading existing roads or constructing new roads, serving new or expanding economic development sites, recreational historical sites, and public use airports. And obviously it's fairly self-explanatory based on the name of the funding program, which one goes with which. The application deadline for these is rolling. It's not a defined application period like with the TA and revenue sharing and smart scale. So again, broken record time. Just encourage you guys to reach out to your VDOT counterparts to try to find out, your eligibility, to provide all the information that will be needed to submit it ultimately to the Commonwealth Transportation Board for their consideration. You see the amounts on the right side of the screen there. So, again, in comparison to Smart Scale and other things, it's apples to oranges, as far as the dollar amounts. But there are considerable amounts of money that can be available. Again, you see with each one, there's various amounts and based on unmatched and matched amounts. And so hopefully you guys might find one of those might fit one of your desired projects. And so Jeb, you'll click one more time there. For any of you folks worried about the social distancing of these two fellows, we have taken measures to separate them appropriately. And so, Jeb, you want to go on to the next slide? So the last thing I'll say to wrap up my portion is we've gone to, again, a lot of application-based processes. Nearly all of our funding programs are through the portal. When I say nearly, I want to, be clear that not all, but most are going through the portal. So if you guys are not familiar with it, I encourage you guys to become familiar with it, do a little research and digging around and help you with that. There are a number of ways to apply, but most of them, again, go through the Smart Portal. And Jay, if you'll click one more time, just want to remind everybody that if you are using a communal laptop or computer, make sure you bring your hand sanitizer, and that was intended to look like blue rubber gloves. Maybe not. We're engineers and planners. We're not artists over here. So anyway, that concludes kind of the funding summary. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jay to walk through this crazy image here.
Thanks, Anthony. It definitely is a crazy image and looks busy, and that's on purpose. I'm going to do a quick poll. If you guys will just tell me whether or not you want Anthony to scream out, "Show me the money," we'll pick that up at the end. This is our 2-year planning cycle. We kind of use this in conjunction with our funding menu when we're talking to localities and regional entities about what type of funds you might go after and the eligibility for your project. So as I pointed out, it's very busy. I'm going to walk you through this very quickly, and then we'll get on to the rest of this, to the presentation. But as you can see here, the fund types are color-coded, or the events are color-coded. In this instance, what's in green is the 6-year improvement program cycle. It's delineated by the different green rectangles on the slide and on the chart. Even years, this is the funding cycle from left to right up top. Odd years are on the bottom. Right now, currently, even though 2020 may go down as the oddest year in history, we are technically in an even year in October, so you can see what's going to come up on the foreseeable future. Immediately, the SGR portal actually just opened for paving and bridge. I think Anthony mentioned that earlier. It'll close in December, about December 11th, I think, is when the portal's set to close. So that's what's on the horizon. We left the HSIP program on here again, as Anthony pointed out, because we want to keep that in the back of people's minds to be thinking about when those things come up on the cycle. But it moves circular around a 2-year funding cycle. This is something to always kind of keep in mind. It's a living document. You see, we last updated this in August of this year. But as things change, if COVID has additional impacts, if things start moving around, we'll kind of keep this updated throughout the year. And we can make this available to everyone afterwards, and you can get in touch with Michaela or myself or Anthony. We can get that out to you. As I mentioned, COVID is definitely going to impact this schedule moving forward. So when we talk about federal programs, if you're considering federal funding, there are some things that you have to be aware of, and won't run through all of these, but these are the big ones that sort of jump out that sometimes give people a pause about whether or not they want to go after federal programs. And just wanted to note that, VDOT's here to assist. Your local program managers are here to help you with these things as you move through it. It's not something you have to figure out on your own. Certainly ADA is the big one that it really comes up very frequently. The Uniform Relocation Act and Davis-Bacon wages are also things. And then, of course, if your environmental research and study on your project indicates that you're going to need a NEPA, that's something else that VDOT is here to assist you with. So keep these things in mind as you go after funds. If you're going to go federal, that they are things you want to consider and make sure that you're prepared to do. With all those, Lumberg would tell you, if you could just follow all the rules, that'd be great. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Fulcher, who will walk you guys through some other ideas on your schedules and estimates.
Thanks, Jay. This is Michael Fulcher. I'm just making sure my audio is working. I was told to use a phone tie-in, so can everyone hear me okay, or anyone?
Yep, we got you.
Okay, great. Thanks. So I've been with the department in Stanton District in the programming section, which in Stanton District, the programming section houses not only programming and funding, but also local project coordination. I've been with the department going on 18 years and been helping localities develop and deliver their projects for about 9.5 years now. So I've been doing it for quite a while. Didn't realize it was that long, so I was preparing this presentation. So hopefully a lot of the information, some of it may be familiar, but hopefully it'll get you to thinking a little bit. Anthony did a great job of explaining all the details of the various programs. Now we're going to take that information and apply it and use it. So what can be our strategy? Now, Jay showed a slide at the beginning, showed all these different puzzle pieces. And a lot of times, you know, when you're putting a puzzle together, you start from maybe the outside and then start filling in the details. So we're going to take all those pieces that Anthony gave us, and we're going to organize them and use them, hopefully. And this will help us to develop a funding strategy. And so there's some major elements to this funding strategy we'll consider. It's the first is the type of project. Is it a divided highway? Is it new location roadway? Or is it maybe simply some intersection improvements, a signal, roundabout, or that dirty word, R-cut? Maybe it's just bike lanes and sidewalk or shared use path, or maybe even smaller spot improvements, perhaps even systemic improvements like Anthony mentioned for the HSIP program. Those different types of projects will lend themselves to different funding sources and maybe require a different strategy as you approach trying to get funding for those projects. What's the estimate? Is it something small in the 50 to 150,000 range, 500,000, maybe all the way up to 25 million? That affects the type of program you would pursue as well. What is the schedule? What is the unconstrained schedule that you could deliver the project in, and what is it with your constraints? When must it be started, or do you have a delivery requirement? Those schedule impacts could affect the program you go after. Are there external factors, stakeholders to consider, environmental issues, or maybe political challenges? All of these items contribute to your funding strategy. So let's talk about the project type on the next slide. What programs are your project eligible for? Is it could it be applied for smart scale, TA, which transportation alternative, revenue sharing, HSIP, economic access, rec access? Can you adjust the project some to make it eligible for other programs? Can you take what is essentially maybe a TA project and adjust it to be competitive for something like HSIP, which, you know, a known safety issue. Now, we know HSIP is kind of being reevaluated for policy changes that Anthony mentioned. It's not really open to the localities at this moment, but that won't always be the case. And of course, he said we're focusing more on systemic solutions rather than spot improvements. So can you maybe create a systemic project out of what you were going for? Maybe it wasn't originally intended to be systemic, but could you adjust it some to accomplish something similar? And don't get caught in thinking a lack of the solution is the problem. And what I mean by that is maybe at an intersection you state, well, the problem is I don't have a turn lane here. Well, is that really the problem, or is it more just congestion is the problem, and you think the turn lane is the solution? So maybe there's another solution to that real problem of the congestion. So try to be open, make sure that project scope is flexible when you're evaluating it for funding applications or funding options. And potentially related to that, can you split it up into phases, perhaps? And I don't mean splitting it up into PE right away in construction and just going and trying to fund PE at first. We don't want to do that, but perhaps split it up into more manageable sections as you go down a corridor. Maybe that greenway may be better suited to be multiple sections rather than just one or two larger ones. Can you pursue different funding sources for the various phases? Maybe this first section could be a good TA project. And then maybe the rest of it could be a revenue sharing. And maybe another one could be, because it's close to a school, could be safe routes to school, which, as Anthony mentioned, it's still TA program, but you get a few extra points if you're near an elementary and middle school and you can pursue it as a safe routes to school project. Maybe that first phase, when there isn't as much support for the project, could be a TA, since maybe you only have to convince the leadership in the locality to commit 20% match. Maybe that's an easier sell. But after that first phase is in place and the people love it, and they wonder what they did without it, and then they want more of that section built, maybe it's more politically favorable at that time to ask for 50% match and go for revenue sharing, try to deliver it sooner, a little bit easier. Let's go to the next slide. We'll talk briefly about schedules and estimates. Now, the initial schedule and estimate is critical to the success you will have in delivering your project as intended. They affect the type of funding you'll pursue, the size of the request, when you will apply, and when you wish to deliver the project. That initial schedule and budget will also get established and baseline in Dashboard too. So we want to be aware of that. That can set us up for success on Dashboard, which is important as well. Now, we do have some new, I just want to put in a little blurb here about PWA has some new templates now, which will help you and your project coordinator to have more of a customized schedule for local projects. And that'll help determine the ballpark of the duration of your schedule. So that's something to keep an eye on as well as you move forward over the next application round or as we create new projects using these new templates. So let's take a little closer look at each of these two aspects. Well, first, we'll talk about schedules. Now, there's two basic types of schedules we'll talk about, constrained and unconstrained. And no doubt planners, you're very familiar with that sort of concept. It's important to consider and analyze both. To ensure we're on the same page, let's illustrate that. Let's say you're a golf ball manufacturer and you have a sale projection of 1 million golf balls for the next year. Well, that's unconstrained. That's the projection of sales. But your production projection is only at 500,000. So that's the constrained number. So there's potentially a loss of 500,000 sales that year. So how can you increase it? Well, you would want to look at what constraints you have. Is it capital and cash flow? Is it a storage warehouse issue? Maybe it's an equipment or labor limitations. Can any of those sorts of things be addressed? And it's the same for your project. If you had a $2 million project and I stroked you a check today for $2 million, when is the soonest you could deliver it with no constraints, no roadblocks? And then when you have that number and you're looking at that schedule, then start looking at it through the reality and start identifying those constraints. And then once you've identified them, can any of those be addressed or removed or mitigated? Now, as an example, professional services. Do you have staff to deliver that project, to develop and deliver it, or do you need to sub that out to a consultant perhaps? Both are viable, but it takes time to procure professional services. It could take many months, potentially. So can you advance that maybe and procure those professional services while that draft 6-year plan is going through the process and as you're getting ready to get close to where you would execute an agreement with us? Maybe you could be ready to issue that NTP to your consultant right when the agreement is being signed. You could take what's in that schedule and make it concurrent with other things to try to remove or at least reduce the amount of it that's on your critical path for your schedule. Is it small enough for your own call? Maybe that's an option as well. Now, some funding sources have time constraints that make you subject to deallocation if you don't start work soon enough. So these are things that you can think about early on in the process. And we know that, unfortunately, COVID has kind of flipped a little bit of this stuff upside down. And maybe it's a little more risky to try to do some of this stuff concurrently, but it's still things for you to think about. Environmental requirements. Do some of these environmental concerns maybe make revenue sharing a more appealing funding source to help you deliver your project faster without having to go through NEPA or the requirements of NEPA? We're not doing anything wrong here. We're just trying to strategize maybe some of our constraints here. Public involvement and right-of-way and utilities. Have you built support for your project with the community prior to requesting the funding? Are you looking at maybe difficult acquisitions, perhaps even considering condemnation on some right-of-way? That takes a lot of time to go through some of those processes. So it's good to be aware of that even when you're looking at application. And TA projects, condemnation is an ineligible expense. So perhaps TA is not the best option for you if that's what you're looking to do. So all of this relates to the funding type. Think about your constraints and determine if you can address any of them. See Doc Brown here, he couldn't get up to 88 miles per hour on the road, but he flipped it and he removed that constraint. He got creative. Can you do that? So when do you need to think about these things? Well, before application. Some of these things well before application. Let's move along to estimates. I think here we'll have a poll if I'm not mistaken. So let's, I'll go ahead and just read the poll. What is the average amount of contingency added to the estimate at advertisement? So this is at when you're getting ready to advertise or even award. Is it 5, 10, 15, 20%? Who needs a contingency at advertising? What's that budget? So we have some options. We'll leave that poll up for a couple of minutes. We'll go ahead and move to the next slide, and I'll go through that. You can finish that as you have an opportunity to. So first, you need an accurate estimate regardless. So this is not an estimating how-to. That could take an entire session just for that. But here are just a few thoughts. Do you have all of the necessary phases included in your estimate? Is it an assumption that you have all the right-of-way and no utilities will be impacted, not one pole or guy wire? Are you absolutely sure? Because adding a phase to a project that's already been started is not nearly as easy as it once was to do. It's better to add all these phases in up front. Did you include enough in your estimate if you needed to procure professional services for assistance, whether it be project management, NEPA, engineering? While it's a good tool to have and use, it does have an additional cost than if you planned on using in-house services. Is the utility estimate realistic? Do you have railroad impacts? If so, did you consider the cost of railroad flagging? Did you take that estimate for your railroad flagging and then quadruple it so that it's only half the amount that it's going to be in the end? Now, I'm just joking. The reality is, in all seriousness, you need to probably double your railroad flagging estimate. Did you include appropriate contingencies based on the current development? And so that's kind of where we're at right now with our poll. Jay, you can finish it out if it looks like everyone's answered it. Still ticking. We'll see the results of that poll. All right, so we have a good mix of 5, 10, 15%, mostly in the 10% range. Actually, at 100% plans at advertisement, you still need to include a 5% contingency. And even at award, when you go through your award submission, and you would take 5% of the bid amount, the apparent low bidder, and actually include that into the funding amount for the award. So what should it be then when you have 0% plans or only conceptual plans? Nowhere near 5%, probably not 10 or 15, maybe even 20 or 25%. Some of you maybe worked with us on these smart scale applications and wondering why we're adding so much for contingencies. But think about it, if we still have 5% at 100% plans, is it really that unreasonable to have 20, 25% when you have no plans and no real clue of some of the impacts you're going to have? How about inflation? When do you expect to receive the funding? Smart scale funding that is applied for this current application route won't be available for many years before you can even begin the preliminary engineering. And then you add the time for the engineering and development to get it to add. That's a long time, which means a lot of inflation. And that's a separate number from your contingencies. But the funding for, let's say, if you apply for revenue sharing, would possibly be available the next fiscal year. So you wouldn't need to include as much inflation, maybe even none at all, depending on where you're at with it. Is it federal or state funding? It takes longer and costs more to develop a federal project, simple as that. State aid projects like revenue sharing is very hands-off by the department, so you can account for that as well. The next two bullets kind of go together, revenue sharing versus TA versus smart scale versus SGR, et cetera. And the amount of the estimate. So revenue sharing has a much larger funding available to support your project. So historically, we've been able to fund through priority 2 revenue sharing applications at 100% up to $1 million per locality, and then prorate over $1 million. That's been in the past. This past round, even though it didn't end up getting adopted into the 6-year plan, we fully funded everything. Regardless, there's stronger funding support for revenue sharing, so you can tackle larger projects. Now, do you know how much each CTB member gets for TA funds? Anthony covered it before in the per fiscal year. Well, each CTB member only gets $1 million per fiscal year. That's it. So if you have $1 million trail project, you're asking for all the TA funds that CTB member has for one fiscal year, and asking for it all on your one project. That's really too big of a project for him or her to be able to fund. So you should be perhaps looking at something else like revenue sharing, possibly HSIP when that becomes available again, or smart scale if you have the time to wait for the funding. The initial budget sets the baseline for the project, so accuracy is important here. Also, some funding pots only let you get one crack at it. SGR is one of them. Historically, you made a request and that was it. You really couldn't come back and say, oh, I missed the estimate a little bit. I need a little bit more SGR funding. You either had to cover it at 100% yourself, or maybe you could look to fill that deficit with some other program like revenue sharing. So once again, you should be waiting. Should you be waiting to the last minute to do this estimate? Well, Hasselhoff says no. He says you need to do it early and reach out to the department for review as soon as possible. Don't cut it to the last minute. It makes it very difficult for us to help you out. Move on to the next point, external factors. We'll consider that for a moment. Do you need to get support of your citizens? That really shouldn't even be a question, should it? You obviously need support. It's critical to your success. I've seen many projects that hit public opposition even when just survey was being gathered because the locality didn't do enough to get support during the application cycle. And that resulted in delays, which led potentially, in some cases, to deallocation of the funds. They basically had to cancel the project. It was unfortunate. So not engaging your citizens early enough and getting their support can truly derail a project. How about political support? Did you have maybe a changeover of your city or town council or county board? And that funding match that you thought was a guarantee of support from that elected body is now in danger of not becoming a reality? I know it's happened, so be aware of those issues. Most external factors aren't within our control, but when we know they exist, we can mitigate them to some extent. And that can be done possibly by the type of funding that's pursued. Now that we have you thinking about some of these things, some of these items, we are going to move into a local perspective of this and see how they have successfully strategized their program. Now let's give our attention to Megan Cronice, the Transportation Planning Administrator with Roanoke County, and get her perspective.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Hey, are we good?
We're good.
Great. Thank you. We've taken all of this fantastic information that Anthony and Michael and Jay have talked about and put it into practice in Roanoke County. So ready to roll, Jay. Thank you. We do have a quick poll question. Have you ever been to Roanoke? These images are technically pictures of the city of Roanoke, whereas I work for Roanoke County. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the options are yes, driven by but never stopped, and no. So as you fill that poll out, we can go to the next slide and learn a little bit about Roanoke County. So we are in VDOT Salem District. Our population is about 94,000, including the town of Vinton. Our metro area is about 314,000. As Anthony mentioned, we are a transportation management area. We hit that milestone in 2010 with the 2010 census. Roanoke County, Jay, we've got another image, is about 250 square miles in size, and it is a donut that surrounds the city of Roanoke and the city of Salem. And because of that, our character is pretty suburban around the cities in the Roanoke River Valley and rural and agricultural beyond the mountain ridges. So the image that's shown now is our Tanglewood area, and it's a view of US 220 running north and mountains in the background, which is beyond the city of Roanoke limits. We have Interstate 81, US Route 11, US Route 220, and US 460 all crossing through the county, as well as the Blue Ridge Parkway. And we have relatively new Amtrak service to the city of Roanoke. So the poll is complete. Oh, we have 70 people who visited Roanoke, and only a few who've driven by and a few who haven't visited at all. For those who haven't been here, please come stop by. We have a fantastic place here in the valley and lots to do. So our Roanoke County funding picture, we'll go over briefly. Our secondary 6-year improvement program back in the good old days, our highest funding in fiscal year 2007 was over $3 million. Today, in fiscal year 21, we have about $354,000 in our secondary plan. So it's a big change and has changed how we fund projects. As we heard a lot about the revenue sharing program, again, back in the good old days in fiscal year 2007, we were able to put $1 million into our capital improvement program to put towards revenue sharing to match with another $1 million of VDOT funds. And we used that money to fund all or parts of 26 projects, many of which were maintenance projects. But today in our CIP, we have $250,000 budgeted per year, which for the 2-year cycle, we can put together for $500,000 to match with $500,000 in VDOT funds. And what we've used it for most recently is to satisfy part of a budget deficit on one project. So that's been a big change as well over the last 15 or so years. In terms of transportation enhancement and transportation alternatives, in the mid-2000s, we used the program every now and then for greenway projects, and we've used it more over the last 10 years for bicycle, pedestrian, greenway, and streetscape projects with varying levels of success. Next slide, please. Oh, and there's the COVID crystal ball. And we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we'll do the best we can with what we have to work with. Hopefully, FY22 won't be horrible. So to talk about HB2 and Smart Scale briefly, for the first round, we applied for 4 projects and were funded. 3 of them were funded for $8.1 million. Second round in 2016, we submitted 5 projects and 3 were funded for about $3.5 million. In 2018, the third round that Anthony talked a bit about, we submitted for 4 projects and we had 1 initially funded for $1.7 million. And that asterisk is what we're going to talk about here in a minute. So we also worked regionally on the Roanoke Valley, the Roanoke Region Transportation Priorities for Economic Development and Growth, which is a mouthful. So we call it the TED study. And this was adopted in March of 2018 by our Roanoke Valley Transportation Planning Organization, which in short is TPO. And this document identified regionally significant projects to facilitate economic development, to lend regional weight and support to many of the submitted Smart Scale applications. So it was submitted, or it was approved just prior to the 2018 Smart Scale round. And what it did was it said, as a region, as a Roanoke region, these are the projects and efforts that we really want to focus on. So it was a great tool to use moving forward. Next slide, please. So the asterisk project is the Route 419 and Route 220 diverging diamond interchange. So the image you can see at the bottom is Route 419 approaching US 220 at the City of Roanoke line. You can see the sign there on the left. The project is located primarily in the City of Roanoke at the edge of Roanoke County. This intersection handles the most vehicle trips in the county and the second most trips in the entire Roanoke Valley. We've got about 40,000 vehicles per day on Route 419 and 52,000 on Route 220. Next picture, please. In 2018, we did count 67 crashes on Route 419 in front of Tanglewood Mall, which you can see in this image. So in that quarter mile in front of the mall, 67 crashes, most of which were rear end crashes. So not only is it one of our busiest corridors, it's also our highest crash rate corridor in the county. So this project is an attempt to fix that. Next slide, please. So the story of the DDI began in January 2017. The county hired Stantec consultants to work on a Route 419 town center plan for this area of the county that proposed the diverging diamond interchange, DDI, to help traffic flow more efficiently. And you can see in the roll at the public meeting on the right, the DDI is in the bottom of that image. And this was our big transportation-focused public meeting for the 419 town center plan. We had city transportation staff there who looked at the concept and went, and we had VDOT staff who looked at the concept and went, And so at VDOT's request, that following May, we extended our contract with Stantec to analyze the DDI concept and to get more information about how it would actually function. That following September, we applied for Regional Surface Transportation Program funding, $750,000 for preliminary engineering for the DDI, which was awarded the following June. So that kind of got us started with some momentum for the DDI project. In March of 2018, the DDI was included in the TED study we talked about that was adopted by the TPO as a regional initiative for the Valley. In August, we applied for Smart Scale funding, $16.8 million for the project. And then in January of 2019, we found out and got some bad news that the DDI was excluded from the Smart Scale staff recommended scenario, as were 2 Smart Scale projects that the TPO had also added RSTP funding to. So there was $9 million in RSTP funds still available. Next slide, please. So in February, Roanoke County asked our TPO to consider reallocating some of that unused RSTP funding to the DDI to see if we could try to make something happen. In March, the Commonwealth Transportation Board indicated that there was additional smart scale funding available due to high-ranked projects that were fundable with other sources. And a week later, the TPO voted to allocate up to an additional $7 million in RSTP funds to the DDI project from that unallocated balance. In May, we had our 6-year plan meeting here in the Tanglewood area in Roanoke County for the Salem District. And our Roanoke County Board of Supervisors chairman, who's also a TPO member, requested surplus smart scale funds for the DDI at that meeting. We also had 5 other citizens also speak in favor of the project. Next slide, please. So a week later, the CTB presentation included a staff recommendation to fund the DDI with surplus high priority and district grant funds, as the TPO had approved up to an additional $7 million to fund the project. So the image at right is a terrible screenshot that I took with my cell phone as I was watching the presentation that I sent to our transportation team, who were in the middle of a board meeting, because I was so excited that we were actually going to be able to fund the project. In June, the CTB adopted the 6-year improvement program, which included DDI funding. And a week later, the TPO allocated $5 million in RSTP funding to supplement the funding that the CTB had approved to fully fund the DDI project. So we were able to pull a massive rabbit out of our hat. So the project programming for this project, we have $5.7 million in RSTP funding allocated between FY19 and 24. And this is because the first bit of funding that we were able to get through RSTP was approved in June of 2018. So this $5.7 million covers preliminary engineering and right-of-way. Our preliminary engineering phase actually started in September 2019 with a kickoff meeting when the funding, or the CTB, had just approved the project the previous June. So, that's warp speed in VDOT project timelines. Our right-of-way phase may start in 2022. The project is going well so far in the PE phase. We're talking about doing a public hearing next year. So $11.7 million in smart scale funding was allocated between FY24 and 25, which is typical for smart scale when the funding is 6 years or so out. This funding will primarily fund the construction phase, which works out really well because the smart scale funding is programmed that far out. So by the time we're done with PE and right of way, we'll be ready to use that construction funding to get the project underway. So obtaining that RSTP seed money helped to get the project noticed as a regional priority when it came time to apply for smart scale. And already having the RSTP funds on the project also made it really easy for the TPO to transfer additional funding to the project later when making decisions fast was critical. And we really owe a lot of thanks to our TPO, which is made up of our elected officials and VDOT staff as well, in helping us to get this project funded and moving along. Next slide, please. So lessons to share. Do your homework. The project is included in a publicly supported and adopted plan. This is the Reimagine 419 plan that was adopted by our Board of Supervisors that the project's included in. The City of Roanoke and VDOT were interested in the DDI from the beginning and continue to support the project. Stantec DDI analysis that we spent extra money on led credibility to the concept. The TED study showed regional support for the project. And then meet with your CTB member to express the need for your project. And we did meet with Dr. Smoot and told him why the project was so important to us and how it would improve some big problems that we had in the county. And then don't give up. Keep up with the CTB agendas and the meetings. I have them on my calendar every month to check in and see what's on the agenda. Be creative with funding scenarios, brainstorm with your VDOT staff, and collaborate with your MPO and TPO members. We have some fantastic Salem District staff who are always helpful in trying to help us figure out how to put money on things. And then show up. Having 6 speakers express support for the project at the spring VDOT meeting brought attention to the DDI. That was one of the projects that had the most speakers on it, so that got attention. Next slide, please. I have some other funding strategies to share that aren't necessarily related to the DDI project, but studies are invaluable. If your locality has the means to do so, consider funding a transportation study for your idea to generate a solid concept and estimate. Better yet, ask your VDOT district planning staff if they have funds available for a study. We've been very fortunate to have a few studies funded by VDOT that have set the foundation for some really fantastic projects. Lean on VDOT. Our Salem District location and design staff took a survey that we funded to conceptually design and generate an estimate for one of our latest smart scale projects. And this was the picture at right is a scoping meeting for that project with several VDOT and county staff in 90-degree heat at 4:30 p.m. on a Friday in late May. So, they are fantastic partners, and we really appreciate the help that they give us in not only, starting at the very beginning and then moving through a project and trying to get money on it. We have amazing staff. And then be creative with whatever funding sources you have available. While there isn't a lot of funding available in our secondary plan, we were able to fund a revenue sharing project deficit with that secondary program funding within the project's program timeframe. So we're able to fill that gap with state funding. And then build momentum. We've used HSIP and revenue sharing awards for small projects as foundations to apply for adjoining larger scale projects. We've done that in several different instances. And we're receiving some new HSIP money for some pedestrian accommodations at signals on Route 419, and we're looking to connect those pedestrian accommodations with sidewalk for potential 5th round project. Next slide, please. Another poll question: which of these strategies are you likely to use to help fund your next project? Select all that apply. Seek multi-jurisdictional and regional support. Study, refine the project ahead of time. Ask for help from VDOT, your PDC, or MPO, or apply for multiple funding sources. And Roanoke County, I think, has done all of these. So with that, Jay, I think that was pretty much my last slide.
Yep, we'll leave the poll open for another 30 seconds or so for people to fill out. Megan, just want to thank you for participating with us today. This last slide's got Megan's contact information on it. If anybody has questions specific for her, feel free to enter those in the chat box if you do. And if they're time permitting, we will certainly cover any questions people bring up. But we will go ahead and move forward. What makes a good application? So what do you need to know before you actually apply for the for project funding? I'll go ahead and post those poll results up, and it looks like we've got a pretty solid across the board. Everybody's going to attempt moving forward to use many, if not all, of these different strategies that we've shared throughout the day, and obviously that's what we feel makes good applications and gives you a strategic advantage to get funds. So building on that, what makes a good application? Well, you need to answer the following questions at the outset. Who's going to be administering the project? Is it going to be a VDOT administered project, or is it going to be locally administered? That will impact not only your costs, but your schedules. VDOT administered projects need to fit into the breadth of projects that we already have going on, and the same for the localities. If you already have your hands full across the board, not just with transportation projects, but with all of the things that you guys do, you're going to need to fit that project into your administration schedule along the way. Does your scope have a logical termini and provide independent utilities as a standalone project? A lot of times we'll find folks that have a need that's right in the middle of something, but it doesn't really tie into anything else. And many of the funding programs, if not all of them, will require logical termini. So is there a way to get creative? Is there a point that you can go just past what your immediate problem is that you need to address to tie into something else that might make your project eligible for a funding type that it might not otherwise be? Can the scope be delivered within the existing site conditions? Do you have poles in the middle of your sidewalks? Do you have underground utilities? Specific design standards? Are there environmental considerations along the way, et cetera, et cetera? As Fulcher pointed out, railroad can be a barrier to some things. So take those things into consideration as you're trying to figure out what it is you want to do and how you're going to address that in your application. Some of our applications actually specifically ask you what the barriers are, not to prevent your project, but to make sure that you know what you're doing before you get into it and what you need to look for. Is the estimate reasonable given the scope? Do you have everything accounted for? Have you included your contingencies? Have you included some costs for inspection and construction oversight, construction management, CEI, for example? Make sure your estimate is all inclusive of the things you're going to need on your project, so that when we're funding it collectively, we've got everything accounted for and we don't get all the way to award and realize we're short. Sometimes that's inevitable. Sometimes it's due to the fact that we didn't plan as well as we could have in the beginning. So the better the estimate is up front, the better we feel the funding will be on the project. And do you have any matching funds? Have you budgeted for any match that's required. You're successful in getting grant applications and you're successful in getting that funding, and whoops, we never really thought we were going to get this money. Now what do? We actually have to find the local match for that. So just planning ahead, looking at that 2-year funding cycle, knowing when things are going to come on board and being approved should help you backtrack and work backwards for your budgeting cycles to make sure you've accounted for the match that may be required. If you've done all that, Urkel would ask you, did I do that? And if Anthony doesn't have to do his voice, I don't have to do Urkel's. So we'll just move on to the next slide. Applicants should work with VDOT staff to refine the proposed project scope and termini. If you're going to be applying for funds from VDOT, make sure that we know ahead of time what the project is, where it's going from A to B. The last thing that we want is to have what is probably a very good application submitted for a funding program and really have no idea what the project is until we're in trying to validate the application itself. So the more you work with us in the front, the better we feel we're able to help you refine those things, look at your cost estimates, help you with PCS estimates and input if those PCS requirements are a part of the application. Picture's worth 1,000 words. If you can provide us with a sketch, that's always helpful. And if you have plan details, if it's something that's already been studied significantly and you can provide that, that's even better to get in the hands of L&D and our construction teams to really look at what your project is. And then some of the tools that we have to help along the way, we have a project development plan and the LEP schedule tool if it's going to be a locally administered project. Those tools are Excel spreadsheets that you can enter a date in the beginning and check off the pieces of your project that are going to be required, be it federal or state, and give you a good idea of what the schedule truly might be on your project. We've all been in a situation where our elected officials may want to see something done in 6 months, and sometimes we have to tell them, nope, that's probably going to be 3 years before that gets delivered. And these are tools that can help deliver that message with some quantitative backup to help along the way and start setting expectations out from the beginning. With that, we're going to jump into the funding exercise. And I'll start by saying that when we did this in person, we were able to break up into groups and give everybody about 15 minutes to consider all the pieces of the outlines and the projects that have been identified to really dive into not only what kind of funding sources you would go after, but what the schedules would be, how you'd budget at the local level to apply for those things, given some constraints that we arbitrarily put on. As you'll see on this funding puzzle slide, some of the things that you want to consider. Michael talked about the corner pieces and your edge pieces and your final pieces. What are you building? What's it going to cost? What's your schedule? And do you have to provide a match? Those are sort of your corner pieces. Those are the things that you really need to set out from the beginning. And if you're working a puzzle, you're looking for those corner pieces. Then you start filling in the edge. What are the eligibility requirements? Is there a local match? When are the applications due? And not only when are the applications due, but when's the funding going to be available? As Anthony pointed out, revenue sharing is every 2 years, and the money's available every 2 years. Whereas Smart Scale is every 2 years, but your funding, you may be looking 4, 5, 6 years out in the future for that. So all of that starts to frame how you're going to be able to deliver your project if and when your applications are successful. And the final pieces are, what are you going to apply for, given all the other considerations, and how did you get to that decision? Not just what are we going to do, but then when someone asks you the question, well, why are you going for that and not this? Do you have those answers? And what we hope to get into today is how you can answer some of those questions. So the next pieces are going to be poll heavy. I'm going to try to put up polls as we move along, and we will go through the outline of what our big project is. So here you can see we've got I-81 running through the bottom of the screen down here. There's a ramp over here that leads into the downtown. There's a little bit of a commercial area going on. And bonus points on the end of the exam if you can tell me what locality this is at in Virginia. It's a real locality in Virginia. There's an existing commercial center here right off of 81. You can see there's some shopping. There's a couple of restaurants, gas station, and a bank. The new development that came into the area was up here. A hospital was built. State-of-the-art technology, and there was some interest once this was built from some other companies in the area to come in. Cyberdyne Systems, which is a biotech research corporation, has a new project, Skynet, and they want to develop next to the hospital with a tie-in so that they have some useful resources nearby. And an access road will have to be built over to this plot of land as a part of that. So we've identified a new access road that's needed off of Route T1000. There were a couple of other industries that wanted to come into the area, knowing that there was new business and new development, dirt being pushed around. There's some couple of vacant properties down here right off of 81 that looked good for the access. Vandalay Industries, which is an importer, exporter of latex and latex-related goods. Some of you guys may be familiar with that company, and also an automotive company, Callahan Auto Parts, wanted to develop. Both of these are highly visible plots of land right next to 81 with good access for shipping. And one of the first things that they encountered when they decided they wanted to point there is there's only one point of egress and ingress here across the railroad tracks. There's going to need to be some significant upgrading to that crossing here to get these folks where they need to go. Adjacent to the hospital and the new jobs coming into town, Sudden Valley development was planned out and constructed actually in advance of the companies coming in. A developer was ready to go, given that it was already an established commercial center, and some improvements were needed with that. And then Chotchke's Bar and Grill, where you can dine with flair, was built over here. So these actually are already in place. So the identified improvements that were needed in the area, improved access over to the two new industries. These roads were already built as a part of the development, but there was a lot of traffic buildup here that we were starting to see that there was going to need to be some improvements made here. And then as all four of them teed up at the intersection of Main Street coming off of 81, a big two-lane roundabout was identified to be needed. Once Skynet and Sudden Valley looked at their plans, they realized they were within walking distance to all of the stuff that's being developed. So some trails were planned for the corridor. And then the existing community decided if they were going to have trails over here, well, we want trails too. So additional trails were planned to lead from the commercial center and residential area already established over to the new areas. All of this coming off of the hospital, the new development at Skynet, and all the new tie-ins also warranted a traffic signal as well. And then with all the new improvements and all the activity in the area, 3 new transit stops were planned. So as we start getting into the polls and the questions, things to consider when you're looking at the overall initiative. Regional population is about 25,000, so there's not going to be any CMAQ or RSTP. The locality has about $500,000 annually to leverage towards the delivery of all the projects. You have to include VDOT funding sources. You can't just ask your rich uncle to help you pay for everything. Elected officials are all in. Don't worry about the politics. If you're an engineer watching this, buy into the fact that the improvements are already studied and that's what we need to do. This is a funding exercise, not an engineering exercise. Improvements that are included in VTrans, and they're all in the local transportation plan. So everything's going to be eligible for everything. That's the assumption we're going to throw over top of this. Everything's going to be locally administered. So running through those list of improvements that we had the access to Skynet, we had the access improvements to Callahan and Vandalay, the roundabouts were in there, a mile of new corridor of trail along the way, all of the trails within a quarter-mile walking distance of all the other trip generators, the traffic signal, and then the 3 transit stops. Now, I want to pause right there before we get into the actual funding exercise. And again, point out, we've provided more info today than you're going to need for the polls coming up. But what I wanted to say is, as you work through this, if you were part of last year's exercise, or even if you weren't, if you want to go back and truly get the most out of what we think is a pretty good exercise, go back and watch the video at the end. Take time to pause it in between the poll questions and think not only about what funding types you might go after, but with these constraints that are on this slide, how might you budget for those improvements over a multi-year funding plan? What would your delivery schedules be if you did it going with your strategy? There's no right or wrong answers to these questions. We're just kind of see what the strategies are for different people in different situations. So with that said, we'll get into the funding exercise. And there you can see old Chris really getting into it. I hope you guys are excited about it as he is. So we'll give you about 2 minutes for each question. If the poll's wrapped up, I'll go quicker than that. But the questions are going to be to identify the potential funding sources for each of the needed improvements. keeping the following in mind. Is the project eligible? Is the funding appropriate for the type of improvement we're going to fund with each question? And if you go back and do this later, do you have enough match to fund these improvements and everything else you want to do? So for this question, what would you go after? If you decide to come back later, think about it in the grand scheme of things. Also applicable to that would be what your design construction schedules are. Your board and council approvals would have to be fit in there, as Megan pointed out. There's many steps along the way for localities before you actually apply. So with that said, we'll look at the overall list of improvements one by one, and you guys bear with me. I'm going to try to get poll questions loaded up to answer. Okay. So question number one for Skynet for the access road. $600,000 project. What funding sources would you seek? Feel free to check all that you might go after, all that you would apply, or if you feel like you could do it with one, just answer once. But the poll is open. I'm given 2 minutes, but we'll probably close it much sooner than that. All right, looks like we got 5 or 6 folks still filling it out. All right, looks about like a minute will be about a good time to close it. All right, let's take a look at the results really quickly. 50 folks said they'd go after economic development access. Certainly that would be at the top of the list of things to go after, given that this is, and I may not have said this, which would have been a key piece, but this is sort of a new regional headquarters for their Skynet initiative. It would be eligible for EDA, so that's a great answer. Revenue sharing, always an option. It's state funded, can be matched 50% to 50%, so that's a good option too. HSIP, probably not going to be a good project for the HSIP, given that it's not going to be systemic. It's not going to be on a high priority corridor, probably not any existing traffic crashes on that T1000 route. But certainly, as Anthony pointed out, even if you think it might be eligible for something like that, reach out to VDOT. Let's talk about it. And Smart Scale, again, probably similar to HSIP. It's probably for this piece alone, not going to be eligible, won't be on VTrans or a high safety impact. But again, with questions, always ask. Better to ask.
Hey, Jay,
Yes.
I was just going to add in real quick. A reason not to pursue Smart Scale would probably be because the timeliness of the funding. Obviously, if you folks in the political realm deal with folks that are looking to relocate or move a business in, they want it to happen yesterday. And so just remember that Smart Scale funding, for the most part, is usually in the out year of the 6-year plan, usually in year 5. And so just be considerate of that if you're thinking about things like Smart Scale based on the timeliness of the availability of the funding.
Yeah, great point, Anthony. Thanks.
This disclosure is one other point. We get into a little bit of eligibility issues with revenue sharing on cul-de-sacs. Usually revenue sharing requires connecting to roadways. So the eligibility for revenue sharing on that may or may not work. I'm not 100% on that.
Another great point. All right, the next piece we'll look at is the 2 major roundabout projects. These are the big dollar projects on this exercise. We're including the traffic signal there at the intersection as a part of this. This is really the major improvements that need to be made for congestion and the new traffic that's generated in the area. I'm going to open the poll for that. So for the roundabouts and the signal work, assuming that the roundabouts are going to be 1.75 for the small one, 4.5 million for the big one, about $500,000 for that signal installation. It's really an upgrade. All told, that gets to be over $6 million, right at $6 million for the total improvement. So what would you go after for this? Keeping in mind those of you that are Arrested Development fans, there's not enough money in the banana stand to fund all these improvements. Looks like we got about 10 more folks still working on it. I just want to go ahead and say thanks to everybody for filling out the polls throughout the day. This would have been really awkward if nobody answered any of them, and it really does help us during this exercise to see what people are thinking about and to help cater future efforts on all of our parts to help with those kind of questions and ideas that are coming up today. We'll go ahead and close it and issue the results. Yeah, I think not surprising. We saw most of the focus going to smart scale and revenue sharing. Smart scale simply because of the size. That's a $6 million. It's really close to that sweet spot that Anthony talked about in that $5 to $10 million range. That I believe it was 90% of the projects that got funded in smart scale fit one of those two ranges. Obviously, there's a lot of things that are eligible in here. It meets congestion. It's going to meet high traffic areas. There's going to be some safety concerns that were identified. The reason we needed the traffic signal put out there. And then revenue sharing, given the timeliness of it, as Anthony just pointed out, it may not be that you can wait because of this development. You may not be able to wait 5 or 6 years for this to come to fruition. And if you're in a locality that has the ability to go after a larger project with revenue sharing, certainly it's a very good strategy. The HSIP answer, yeah, certainly with the signal, that's a great strategy. Reaching out to your VDOT folks to see if that's something that, with what could be construed as a systemic improvement that's going to be needed, HSIP might be a good strategy. TA, there may be some components of this that would meet TA, maybe some of the sidewalks and crosswalks that have been identified, if they tied into the larger transportation area and the trails that we pointed out might be eligible. EDA, that might be a stretch just given the distance that they are, but certainly down here, this tie-in where we're running into the new development, it could be a piece of a larger application. So again, really no wrong answers per se. It's going to be an eligibility question and working with folks in a collaborative way to see what the options are.
Hey Jay, this is Anthony. Just real quick to add in for the folks that chose TA, not to pick on you, but just want to point out that, again, recall that there's a limited amount available each fiscal year. Each district, each CTB member only gets about $1 million per fiscal year. And so as you see the cost estimates on the screen, that sometimes you almost cost yourself out of certain programs. So just, again, be aware of all the various parameters with each funding program.
All right, we'll go on to the next piece here. This is the larger access question down to Vandalay and Callahan. $3 million for all the improvements, all told, that are going to be needed down there. And how might we fund these improvements? It's going to be the same answers on all the poll questions, just familiarity. Keeping in mind we've got that railroad crossing that needs to be addressed. We are providing access to 2 new industries, but we are also tying into new improvements along the way. couple more people. Looks like they're still filling out. We'll leave it open about 10, 15 more seconds. All right, can go ahead and close it. And again, good across the board. You guys have identified the need to go after the economic development access is definitely a good strategy for these. These are going to be manufacturing, industrial type of projects, which would be eligible for the access for EDA. A lot of you folks pointed out that the rail crossing would be a good option for the improved access for the rail crossing. There's actually a separate piece. If you look in Smart Portal, there's a separate portal for railroad crossings, at-grade railroad crossings. FHWA and VDOT work together to provide a specific set-aside for those type of improvements. So that's definitely a good strategy for this one. Revenue sharing, always going to be popular, as Anthony pointed out, and definitely given the timeliness that might be needed, you may have to go after multiple funding sources to get something like this funded. And then smart scale, sure. If you're looking at about how it might tie in to that, I'll make the same note that Anthony pointed out. If you have industries that are ready to build and really need this access almost immediately to come in, that might not be the way to go. But if they're looking at a 3-4 year build out to get their facilities up and running before they're actually going to be running trucks in and out of there, sure, smart scale might be a good option for that. Anyone else have anything to add to that before we move to the next one? All right, hearing none, we'll go on to the next one. All right, this time we're going to talk about the trail system. There's 1 mile of new trail along the corridor, estimated about $2 million. It'll take about 48 months to implement. So what funding options are out there for the trail? I should point out, if we haven't already, that all these you're able to answer more than one answer, which looks like many of you are, which is good. And pointing out something that Fulcher added in his presentation, not to give away some discussions that we've had, but this would be $2 million, keeping in mind what the size of the TA program is, which is going to be a popular option for this. Are you going to be able to fund the whole thing with TA? And how many years might that take you as you're looking at this down the road? All right, we'll do about 10 more seconds on this one. All right, taking a look at these results. As expected, TA, the popular choice, I think that's a good one. Kind of as I touched on, I think $2 million, you might not get it all in one bite, but this may be a multi-year phased approach to the trail if you want to go exclusively after TA funds for this. Certainly, as Megan pointed out, they have been successful in going after phased approaches to some of the bigger trails in the Roanoke Valley. The Roanoke River Greenway certainly is a major success for the TA program, among others. Revenue sharing, again, popular choice. You particularly with the timing that's involved, you may want to go after that. And if you have the match it. Smart scale, it is a $2 million project for some localities. That's going to be a big project. For others, maybe not so much. This does look like an approach to something that you're not going to need immediately. It's something that can be delivered over a few years. So that might be a good option. EDA, there may be some components that could tie in with the EDA, given where we're coming from and providing some continuity to trails. But typically that EDA is only going to be for road or on-road facilities. Some of you may be familiar with the rec access program where they have a separate carve out for bike ped. They don't really have that separate carve out for EDA, so it would be an EDA grant that would have to be part of on-road facilities, I believe. And then a couple of folks went after the recreational access. So with the rec access program, there has to be a designated recreational facility that's approved by the Department of Conservation and Recreation at the state level. If there was a recreational facility designated as such in this area, certainly could go after those rec access funds. The rec access program is relatively small, so there might be a piece of this that could tie in if there was a facility. We haven't specifically laid out a facility in this area, but if one was built, there could be some of that. There's also some confusion. There's a recreational trails program, which is not actually handled exclusively by VDOT. That also goes through another department, but it's sort of under the TA umbrella, and that might be an option as well. So again, I would just stress, if you've got an idea you think might work with your VDOT counterparts at your district and your contacts to see what might be out there. So good answers across the board too. So we're going to add the transit stops in here and ask you guys to take a look at everything, the whole kit and caboodle. How might we fund this entire initiative? And again, the question will be, how do you do this with all of the other components taken into consideration at once? Do you think smart scale would be a good approach to this? That's the poll question. We'll go about 15 more seconds on this one. I'll only give you two options because there's a bit of a discussion, I think, to be had with this one. All right, so the majority of folks felt like smart scale would be a good option. And then there were a few that said no. And what was interesting is to see the initial responses were yes, with only a couple of no's. And then as time went on, some no's populated a little more. You saw about 10 no's come in at the end. And I think, again, there's no right or wrong answer to this. And I think this is a perfect example because, yes, I think this would be a good application for smart scale in that it's a large dollar amount that we're talking about. It's about 12.5 million, give or take, for the total initiative. There are pieces that would make it very attractive to the smart scale scoring system. It's got traffic impacts. It's got bicycle and pedestrian, transit, multimodal. It touches economic development. So it's probably going to score very well. Now, the more you think about it, though, I think where the no's also have a valid point is the timing. If you need this immediately to entice these developments to come in, obviously we're not going to be able to wait 5 and 6 years for funding to be able to come in and make these improvements. You may miss out on that potential development. They'll go somewhere else that's ready to roll. So again, I think yes and no are probably both correct answers on this. And then that's really what we wanted to get in and talk about is there is no one size fits all solution, no silver bullet to every transportation problem. And what we hope that this exercise does is kind of help people think about overall initiatives. How can you take bites out of your needs and fund them as you can and have the ability to, and as funding becomes available? Before I leave this slide, I want to make sure if there's anything that Anthony or Megan or Michael want to add kind of overall in the exercise before we move on.
Hey, this is Anthony. I'll just say, I think, Jay, you did a good summary there, especially at the end of why smart scale will. Each area, each project, each locality is going to have different nuances as to whether or not the certain funding programs fit. And I think a takeaway I would want you guys to have is that we encourage you to start early in your discussion processes with your district staff. They can obviously bring in local assistance division staff from central office, bring in your residency staff, kind of help lead the charge of determining what are the best funding options. There is no one size fits all approach. I think that's why we've kind of left some of these open-ended. That's why we provide things like the funding menu, and why we make ourselves available, not just in our district, but all districts as well, to you folks to start these conversations early. And so again, I think Jay, you've done a good summary of why not all these fit into textbook yes, no, black and white answers. Some of these are very gray areas, and so a lot of you guys that operate with us and delivering your transportation program knows that the gray area is a place we hang out in a lot. And so anyway, I think this has been a good exercise to illustrate that.
All right. We'll go to summary slides here. Again, just to kind of point out before we jump into the summary, if you want to go back and take a more in-depth dive into that exercise, I think there's an opportunity to go back and look at it and kind of factor in the other pieces of the puzzle we didn't have time today to cover. Are there budget constraints? Are there schedule constraints that might influence your answers on some of those? And it might be worth going back and taking another look at. But in summary, we want to plan ahead. Make sure you're touching base with not only your regional entities, your PDCs, your TPOs, MPO areas, get all the assistance that you can. Use that funding menu and the funding cycle to talk about your planning. Make sure you have a solid project estimate and schedule in place before you start an application or before you start down the road to delivering a project. Make sure you keep track if you need public input, what kind of public input you're going to need, planning efforts that have been involved, VTrans, if that's an option, if you need to get in VTrans, what is the cycle for VTrans updates, and making sure that you're timing your project development in coordination with VTrans updates. And the biggest thing, see the forest and the trees. Think big and small. Think about that overall initiative we talked about. That's a $12.5 million project that some folks may initially have thought you got to take a swing at smart scale, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But there were definitely little pieces in there, bites that could be taken, projects that could be phased so that you can deliver them as they're needed, maybe for the adjacent development or adjacent immediate improvements that you could fund. That overall, when you put forward that final smart scale application, maybe you've got a third of it already funded from other sources, which is going to buy down that smart scale score. So think big and small in your projects. There's no one single solution for every locality or for every project. Each one's going to be different depending on your situation. And then lean on your friends, friends at VDOT, friends at the regional entities. Make sure you're crowdsourcing your opponents or your components of your project. And then if you've got any rich uncles, like I mentioned, particularly that guy in the middle, keep him in the loop, keep VDOT and LAD involved as you're developing your projects so that we can all assist you. With that, that's the end of the presentation. If anybody has any questions, feel free to enter those in the chat box. Michaela, Tracy, I don't know if there was any entered along the way that we might have a few minutes before we hit the 2-hour mark to cover, but I will turn it back over to Michaela to see if there's any questions.
Hey Jay, so I didn't see a whole lot of questions come in. I did see from Bud Siegel, he said at some point, can you discuss funding available to localities for planning studies? Is this the VDOT STARS program, or are there other opportunities?
Hey, I know Michael provided some input, and he might want to jump on this as well. This is Anthony. I'll just add that, Bud, yes, it can be the STARS program. I'll tell you, for our district, again, the Salem district, we usually only get about 2 projects a year funded, planning studies funding through that program. And I think next year we really only have 1. So I would encourage, again, every district might be different, but I would encourage folks not to put all their eggs in that basket. We do have some planning funds available at the district level. Again, I'm speaking for us. We have an on-call consultant that we can take advantage of as needed. Again, it's not a huge amount of money, but there is some there. So again, I would just encourage folks to reach out to their local programming or planning staff to see what's available, and then we can have those one-on-one conversations, because every district's going to be different and every project's going to be different about what planning money best fits. But again, there is some available. And it's not just the STARS program, although the STARS program is a good option. And again, typically STARS is more corridor wide, at least in our district has been more corridor approach. So again, if you have one that fits into that framework, then maybe that is a good program. So just wanted to piggyback on what Michael has already provided there in the chat box.
Yeah, this is full try. I'll kind of reiterate what Anthony said. Same in Stanton District. Our planning guys are really willing to help, especially the smaller localities. Like Anthony said, STARS is lending towards kind of larger studies. If it's a larger locality, a lot of times they're able to kind of leverage some MPO funds to help them with some of that. But some of our one-off smaller localities have been helped by our planning section actually performing the studies, whether it be themselves or kind of evaluate it through our on-calls.
I'm going to jump real quick, completely unrelated to what we're just talking about. There was a really good point made in the chat box that maybe some of you folks missed. Penny and Heather both noted that the FLAP application period is open, but ends on October 15th. So pretty quick turnaround for you folks if you're just finding out about it today. So I want to make sure you guys caught that the FLAP call for projects application ends on October 15th.
There is another question that came in. Maybe Russ, you can jump in on this. It said, is anyone from central office who can elaborate on revenue sharing funding for projects that were submitted October 2019?
Michaela, this is Kim Pryor. I can try to answer that. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Great. Thank you, Kim.
Sure. We're going to be presenting a plan to the Commonwealth Transportation Board at their meeting this month, recommending that we add those revenue sharing projects later this year, this calendar year. So I would encourage you all to just watch that board presentation. It's still evolving right now, but we are recommending to move forward with those.
Michaela, I can tell Tamara Ambler, which is the Stanton District Environmental Manager, makes a good point about mixing federal funds and state funds on a corridor by separating out projects. So if you get into that situation, don't forget you may be federalizing the entire corridor, so we may need to do a NEPA document on the whole corridor, even though we carve out state-funded portions. So there are details that we didn't get into today that affect those sorts of things. But just work closely with VDOT and we can help work through those sorts of issues.
All right, we have another question that came in. Would you please review the smart scale eligibility requirements that a project meet a need stated in VTrans? How specific requirement is that?
Yeah, I guess that'd be me. This is Anthony again. I would hope if there's anyone from the VDOT planning side that wants to chime in, feel free to do so. But it is a very specific requirement. A project has to meet a VTrans need. It has to meet a need that's been identified in VTrans in order to be eligible for smart scale. And that can be, and that's probably a much larger conversation than this would permit. But if you have a potential project, reach out to your district planning staff or your programming staff to see whether or not it already meets a need. VTrans is going through an effort right now where needs have been identified, and now they are prioritizing those needs. And so that VTrans is something that folks need to keep their finger on the pulse of. As you guys see correspondence come out about VTrans, it's very important to the smart scale program. It's creeped in a little bit into some of the other funding programs. I recall in revenue sharing last year, there was consideration given to projects where the project met a VTrans need that had been identified. And so VTrans is an important piece, and for as Smart Scale goes, it's a very specific requirement.
Michaela, this is Jay. We're at right at 2 hours. I don't think any more questions coming in. The poll closed on whether or not Anthony should scream "Show me the money." It was 100% yes, but I think his line may be muted at this point. So unfortunately, we won't be treated to that. But with that, if there's any other questions, we can bring them up now. Otherwise, I want to thank everybody for your participation today. Certainly, participation in the polls made things more feedback was better for us, and I certainly appreciate the feedback. And again, if there's an opportunity to go back and watch it and expand upon the exercise, we certainly encourage you to do that. And any questions for any of the members, you can respond back to Michaela, or we can have her send out maybe a response with all of our contact info in it to get that out there to everyone.
Yeah, so we did record today's webinar. We will have it posted on our website by the end of next week. We will be sending a link to where it's posted at to everyone who had registered for this webinar. So if you had any coworkers or anything that had registered and weren't able to pop on, they should still be getting the email with where it's posted. I do want to thank our presenters today, Megan, Anthony, Michael Vulture, and Jay, for all that y'all did. I think this went really well, and I hope that everyone that joined us today really enjoyed the webinar. We will be having another webinar next month. We're in the process of getting that set up and scheduled. So as soon as we have everything confirmed for that, we will be sending out another email blast like we did for this webinar and the one that we had last month as well. But if you have any questions about the webinars or need anything, please let me know. Again, my name is Michaela McCain, and my email is michaela.mccain@vdot.virginia.gov. All right, I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.